Hey, it's James Mulvaney here, founder of Matchmaker.fm. Welcome back to the learning series. In this video, I want to give you another presentation and really talk about how to maximize every interview you're doing and getting the best results from your guest as a podcaster as you can. Now, I think there's a real skill in being a good interviewer. It's not something that necessarily comes natural to all of us. And also doing an interview on a podcast is different to doing other types of interviews. So perhaps you're, a CEO of a company and you're used to conducting job interviews, or maybe you're a journalist and you're used to doing interviews for newspapers. So really what I wanted to do is show you how to get the information that you want as a podcaster, get those interesting stories, those all important little nuggets of information from your guest's kind of head, and I suppose get them out through the microphone onto your hard drive, as a recording. It's a real skill doing good interviews. So hopefully this presentation, the idea is to give you a format to follow and some guidance and some common little tips and techniques that are used by expert interviewers to produce the best results. So without further ado, let's dive into a little presentation I've prepared for you. Welcome to the Podcaster's Guide on how to interview. Now, if you're like me and you're a bit of a podcast fan, you'll have heard podcasts with great interviews and you'll have heard podcasts with awful interviews as well. Some really bad ones, actually. And that's the thing with podcasting. It's open free speech. I understand that. But ultimately, if you're really serious about becoming excellent at podcasting and you want to grow your audience, you need to make sure that the content you're putting out is really engaging and of the best possible quality you can. So here is 10 different strategies or tips or principles that you can implement in your interview technique, and sort of really not just the interview technique itself, but actually sourcing guests as well. That's where it all begins. You need to find the best possible guests you can. There's no point of interviewing people who aren't very interesting. And it doesn't matter if they've got letters after their name or if they're a CEO of Microsoft or something. You need to be finding people who've got really genuinely engaging and interesting stories to tell. So what I wanted to do is start off by giving you a few pointers, of how to do this. So firstly, what I'd recommend is you interview people where they've had previous experience of doing podcast interviews, or they're good public speakers at least. You need to be able to find people who are good talkers, because if someone's not been on a podcast before, and perhaps it's the first podcast they've ever done, the chances are they might not be very conversational. They're not going to be as good as you perhaps like. Ultimately relying on one form of communication, which is audio. So you need to make sure that they're a good talker in principle. So when you're researching guests, listen to podcasts that they've done before, watch videos, and try and find out as much information as you can about them to make sure that they're going to be a good fit for what you're trying to produce ultimately. So what I'm saying is you need to do your research. Once you've found a guest you think would be a potentially good candidate for your podcast, find out as much information as you can about them. So have a look at their social media accounts, have a look at their about page, have a look at their LinkedIn profile. What jobs have they had in the past? How has their career progressed? Have they written any books? Perhaps read some of the books that they've written, or as I mentioned before, listen to some other podcasts that they've appeared in. But try and find as much as you can about that guest before you actually jump into that interview. So once you've done your research, you've sort of thought this person's a good guest, maybe you've reached out to them and they've agreed to appear on your podcast, the next step is to have a really good pre-interview process. And actually, I'd say that starting with a pitch is a really good way to get people engaged, from the kind of your initial approach as to, well, why should they be on your podcast, right through to that day where you record. This is what I would describe as the pre-interview process. So you need to be selling the podcast, selling the benefits of why they should appear on your podcast, because ultimately, and most of the time, guests are appearing for nothing, right? So why should they give up an hour of their time or 2 hours of their time to come and chat to you? So you need to start with a solid pitch or as your foundation. But once you've done that, be organised about, who you're contacting, following up with them. If they haven't replied to you, have they booked a date in the diary to speak to you beforehand? Again, I think having conversations with people off air, so to speak, before you actually hit that record button is a great way to build rapport. And I've been in situations before myself as a guest where perhaps I've spoken to, it might be a PA or a producer or someone associated with the podcaster who's kind of organizing all of this for them. And they will ask me questions to qualify me as a guest, to make sure that I do know what I'm talking about, or, the story that they want me to talk about is kind of relevant, and am I a relevant guest for that specific podcast? Kind of almost like a vetting process. And then after that, I'll speak to the person who's hosting the podcast themselves. So there's these different layers to making sure that the guests are the right fit for the podcast. So as process-driven as you can be about this, I believe is the way forward. There's no point of just trying to make it up as you go along. Don't just get people on and hit that record button. What I'm saying is try and be prepared, have documents in place, structure, use something like Trello to manage people. And, as you identify a potential list of guests, you then maybe move them down to the next column on Trello when you've sort of had a communication with them. You maybe then move them to the next category when you've got the date set to record. Be organized about this stuff. What you don't want to be doing with guests is messing them around at all. So make sure that, if they agree to be at a certain place to record, or they've scheduled a date, that you're actually turning up and making sure that you take full advantage of that opportunity. All right, so next up, write probing and tailor-made questions. Now, there's two key phrases here. Probing, meaning the questions are going to push the guest and you're going to try and get information from them, perhaps that other podcasters haven't. So if you've done your research and you know that they've said something in the past, we'll say, okay, well, you mentioned that in the past, but what do you think about it now? You can use that to build questions. And when I say make tailor-made questions, what I hate is just when people just have generic questions that they ask everyone. So you should be making sure that some of your questions at least are tailored specifically to that individual versus just having like a generic list of questions that you can ask. Now, I'm not saying generic questions are a bad thing because they can be good fallbacks, and I'll get to that in a second. But really tailoring those questions and making sure that they are specific to that guest's area of expertise or that guest's journey or their story is going to make a much more compelling piece of content versus just asking them generic questions. So, be flexible. There's two ways which you need to be flexible. Firstly, you need to be flexible with the person's time. Now, if the guest has to reschedule the recording, don't hold it against them. You're going to have to just accept that sometimes people have other things going on in their lives. They've got meetings that they need to attend to, other bits of business. So don't expect them to always turn up first time around. And if they have to reschedule the recording, that's just the way it goes. I've had guests that I've been really excited to speak to. They've unfortunately had to pull out at the last minute, and I've not had a chance to speak to them again. It happens, but don't get rude or aggressive towards them. Just kind of accept it and move on. Follow up in a few months' time. Sometimes people's schedules are just crazy busy, especially if they're perhaps senior partners within a business, or they've got very, very hectic schedules. They're all traveling all over the world, whatever. So you have to be flexible in your kind of timing, and if they ask to reschedule, just accept it and try and squeeze them in where you can. The second way you should be flexible is in your interview technique. Okay, if you've prepared a list of questions and maybe they don't want to answer some of the questions, that's fine. You could always send them the questions beforehand just to give them an idea of the topics you want to cover, but also as well, be prepared to actually kind of go off script a bit if they're talking about something that's really interesting. And this kind of leads on to the next point, which is keeping conversation flowing. You don't want your interview to sound too rigid. You don't want your interview just to be kind of question, answer. So asking questions and then being flexible about the questions you then ask, leading that discussion, is the key, I believe, to a really successful interview. That's what makes a difference between a good interview and a great interview, is that kind of bond between two humans and how the conversation is flowing from one question to another, and sort of learn how you can perhaps link things together as well. So it doesn't just sound like you're reading off a sheet. Pick up on something they say and say, well, it's interesting you mention that because, I was also thinking about X and Y, and, then link it to the next question. So I was thinking about X and Y, and that leads me on actually to sort of the next question, which was going to be try and make it sound conversational versus just like, oh, hello, what is your name? Yes, so what do you do? Try and make it a bit of a conversation and keep that conversation flowing. Ultimately, that's your responsibility, right? You have to own the conversation. As a podcast host, it's solely your responsibility. The guest is there, of course, to cause conversation and input, But your job as a host is to just do exactly that, host the conversation, try and keep things moving forward as well. But when I say that, you have to be careful that you're not being too sort of pushy. You have to let the guests speak. I've been on podcasts before where they've asked me questions and they've then ended up speaking more about themselves as the host than what I was saying. I've been on a couple of podcasts actually where I feel like the host has done more of the talking than I have because they've not really let me get a word in edgeways, or I'll mention one thing and then they'll sort of start talking about themselves and how that applies to them. It's like, well, hang on, if I'm the guest here, you've invited me on your podcast, surely I should be the one doing most of the talking. So remember, there's a time and a place to let people speak. Now, I'm not saying, because guests sometimes do have a habit of meandering, going off topic, or suddenly if you've got a set time limit, let's say you're trying to record for 30 or 40 minutes, you've got into 20 minutes, they've only been talking about one topic. Now, there's no harm in trying to keep it structured and keep it on topic and sort of bringing them back in. But ultimately, you've got to let them speak and you've got to make it all about the guest, because that's ultimately why you've invited them on in the first place. So, listen actively, and as I said just now, make it all about them. When you're listening actively, what I mean by that is, actually paying attention to what they're really saying. So one of the things you can do once you're kind of talking is, look at your list of questions, and sometimes you'll find that questions get answered, making sure that you're kind of crossing them off, or if you need to like rearrange things as the interview's going. Sometimes I've sat down with a guest, I've thought, okay, I've got a plan, I want to talk about this, this and this, and I've kind of got this sort of running order in front of me, and it turns out that, they talk about point number 1 and then they talk about point number 10 after point number 1, where you've got to try and remain on your toes. And this is really where it's a skill in itself, actively listening to what they're saying, whilst remaining in control and actively listening to them, but ultimately make the podcast all about the guest. And the other thing as well is, go back and listen to your old interviews. Once you've recorded an interview, and again, if you're editing this podcast yourself, it's quite easy to do this, but if you're like me and you have someone else who's actually editing the podcast, well, actually listen back to your episodes and think, right, what could I do to make that better next time round? What were the good points? What were the bad points? That's really the role of a producer in the traditional radio industry, is to help the presenter improve. So, sometimes you have to kind of act as your own producer and be, giving yourself feedback. But listening actively and learning how to develop a good active listening ear is a really good skill to have when you're recording podcasts, and especially when you're interviewing people. So finally, following up and promoting. What I mean by this is, firstly, follow up with the guests. Once you've recorded the episode, that's not the end of your relationship. Sometimes you can use podcasts as great networking tools, so it's always good to stay in touch with as many guests as you can, particularly if you found that conversation really captivating. There's no harm in following up with them. But also it's really good, I think, to try and get a stamp of approval from the guest before you actually push that episode out. So once it's been edited up, send them a copy for their review. Just say, look, are you happy with this? We're going to push it live on this date. Be clear and communicate. And when I say promote, you need to try and make sure your guests are promoting the episode on their social media channels, pushing it out to their networks. But also you've got to do that as well. They've given up their time for you. Quite often the guests will have a kind of objective. They might want to be promoting a product or a service or a book or whatever it might be. So give them as much promotion as you can. Make sure you've got a clear social media strategy. And for every single episode that you do, you've got a clear set of instructions for the guests. Look, please, can you put this out on your channels? Here's some video clips, or it might be, here's a link to the podcast. Be clear in your communication to them. And you'll get the best results, and that will ultimately help you grow your audience. But ultimately as well, what you want to do is make sure that they're benefiting from it as well. Thanks for watching. Hopefully you have gained some insight into how to be a great interviewer from that presentation. If you've got any more tips for people who are looking to be as best interviewers as they possibly can, I invite you to leave them in the comments below. We're always looking for new ideas and new ways to help people improve. Ultimately, sharing knowledge is one of the core values of what Matchmaker is all about. So please put your interview tips in the comments below, and I'll speak to you soon. All right, take it easy.